Mara's eyes snapped open in the middle of the forest, and the first thing she felt was the cold press of dirt under her bare knees. She was kneeling. She had not chosen to kneel. Around her, the trees stood so close together that the sky above was only a thin silver seam, and in that seam hung a moon so bright it looked painted on. 4 small shapes moved through the grass toward her, low and quick, their paws silent. Wolf pups. Not 1, not 2, but 4, each with fur the color of wet stone, each with eyes that caught the moonlight and threw it back gold. She tried to stand, and could not. Her legs would not obey her. The pups circled her once, twice, sniffing at her sleeves, and then they lost interest in her completely, and turned toward the center of the clearing, where something was waiting. A stone slab rose out of the earth, like a table set for a feast no one had ordered. On top of it sat a single cabbage, round and pale green, its outer leaves peeled back and folded like the collar of a coat. Someone had placed a small circle of white lace over its crown, delicate as a bride's veil, and the sight of it should have made Mara laugh. It did not. Her chest was tight, with a feeling she could not name, something between awe and dread, the way a person feels standing at the edge of a cliff they did not mean to walk to. The pups took their places at the 4 corners of the slab. Then, from somewhere behind the black wall of trees, a low sound rolled across the clearing, deeper than thunder, and every hair on Mara's arms rose at once. A shape stepped out of the dark. It was a wolf, but calling it a wolf felt wrong, the way calling a mountain a hill would be wrong. He was massive, silver from muzzle to tail, with old scars threading through his fur like rivers on a map, and when he moved, the pups bowed their heads to the ground without being told. Mara's breath came fast and shallow. She was afraid, and yet some part of her, the part that had always chased strange dreams instead of running from them, leaned forward to watch. The huge wolf walked to the slab and stopped before the cabbage. The 4 pups lifted their heads and began to howl, not the wild, lonesome howl of nature documentaries, but something structured, something with rhythm, rising and falling like a hymn sung in a language older than words. The sound moved through Mara's body like a current. She felt it in her teeth. 1 pup broke from the circle and trotted to the wolf's side. It carried in its small jaws a length of red thread, and it wound the thread once around the wolf's foreleg, then once around the base of the cabbage, tying the 2 together in a loose, ceremonial knot. Mara wanted to ask what it meant. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out, as if the dream had decided that this was a scene she could only watch, never join. The 2nd pup approached next, this one carrying a sprig of dark green leaves that smelled, even from a distance, of rosemary, and something sharper underneath, like the smell after lightning. It laid the sprig at the base of the cabbage, and stepped back, tail low, ears pinned in what looked, absurdly, like reverence. The 3rd and 4th pups came together, walking side by side, and between them, they dragged a small bundle of birch bark, tied with more of the red thread. They set it down beside the sprig and the knot, and the enormous wolf lowered his great head until his nose nearly touched the cabbage's pale crown. Mara realized, with a jolt that ran straight through her sleeping body and into whatever bed she was actually lying in, that this was a wedding. It was absurd, it was impossible, and yet nothing about the moon or the trees or the shining eyes of the pups suggested even the smallest joke. This was solemn, this mattered. The wolf spoke. Not in growls, not in barks, but in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once, low and rolling, and though Mara had never studied any language beyond the one she was born into, she understood every word, as if it had been placed directly into her mind. He spoke of seasons that must turn without failing. He spoke of roots that must be fed, and rain that must be allowed to fall, and paths through the wood that must never be paved over or forgotten. He spoke of a promise made a long time ago, between the ones who walked on 4 legs and the ones who walked on 2, and how that promise had to be renewed, again and again, or the balance between them would break. Mara did not understand what any of it meant, not really, but she understood the weight of it, the way you can understand grief on a stranger's face even in a country whose language you don't speak. Then one of the pups, the smallest of the 4, turned away from the ceremony and looked directly at her. It should not have been able to see her. She was an observer in this dream, a ghost drifting at the edge of the clearing, unseen and untouched. But the pup's gold eyes fixed on hers with a precision that made her stomach drop, and it took 2 steps toward her, then 3, until it stood close enough that she could see the individual hairs on its small muzzle. It opened its mouth, and a voice came out that did not match its tiny body at all, a voice older and steadier than anything that small should have been able to hold. It said her name. Mara had never told anyone in the dream who she was. She had not spoken a single word since she arrived in the clearing. Yet the pup said it clearly, without hesitation, as if it had known her for years, as if it had been waiting in that clearing for the specific moment she would arrive. Then it said something else, quieter, almost swallowed by the low chanting of the wedding behind it. Mara strained to catch it. The words seemed to bend and slip, the way important things do in dreams, refusing to stay solid long enough to be understood. She caught fragments, something about morning, something about a door, something about not being ready. Behind the small pup, the great silver wolf lifted his head and let out a howl that shook the leaves from the nearest branches. The other 3 pups joined him, and the sound built into something enormous, something that seemed to press against the inside of Mara's skull like weather pressing against a window. The trees at the edge of the clearing began to move, not sway, not rustle in wind, but move, as though the trunks themselves were rearranging their positions, closing in, tightening the circle around the wedding slab. Their branches stretched upward, and then curled, black against the silver sky, reaching like fingers grasping for something just out of reach. Mara's heart slammed against her ribs. The small pup was still looking at her, its gold eyes wide and urgent now, no longer solemn but almost pleading. It opened its mouth to speak again, and this time she was sure she would understand. This time the words would land clean and whole. The ground beneath her tilted. The howling wolves, the veiled cabbage, the closing trees, all of it tipped sideways, as if the whole clearing had been set on a table someone had just bumped, and Mara felt herself falling, though there was nowhere to fall to, only darkness rushing up to swallow the moonlight whole. She woke with a gasp that filled her whole chest, her hand flying to her sternum as if she needed to hold her heart in place. The ceiling above her was her own ceiling, cracked in the corner the way it had been for months, the fan turning lazily overhead, exactly the way she had left it before bed. Sunlight was already sliding through the gap in her curtains, thin and gold, nothing at all like the moonlight from the dream, yet somehow just as unsettling. She lay still for a long moment, waiting for her pulse to slow, replaying what she had seen. 4 wolf pups, a cabbage in a veil, an alpha king with scars like rivers, a small pup that had said her name in a voice too old for its body. She pressed her palms against her eyes and told herself, the way she always told herself after a strange dream, that it meant nothing, that her mind was simply doing what minds do at 3 in the morning, stitching together nonsense from the scraps of the day. But even as she thought it, she knew it was a lie she was telling herself out of habit. This dream did not feel like nonsense. It felt like the opening line of something much larger, something that had only just begun, and somewhere deep in her chest, underneath the fading fear, a small, persistent voice kept whispering that the morning was not going to let her forget what she had seen. It was right. She sat up slowly, swinging her legs over the side of the bed, and noticed, without quite registering it yet, a smell drifting in from the direction of her kitchen. Green and earthy, faintly sweet, unmistakably familiar. It was the smell of a fresh cabbage, cut open and left in the open air. For a moment she simply sat there, listening to the ordinary sounds of her house settling around her. A pipe ticking somewhere in the wall, a car passing slowly on the street outside, and she tried to talk herself into believing that the smell was nothing, a trick of a half-awake mind, still tangled in the last threads of sleep. She had smelled stranger things upon waking before, phantom scents that vanished the moment she stood and moved through her rooms. She told herself this was simply another one of those, a residue of dreaming that would dissolve the instant she splashed cold water on her face. But the smell did not dissolve. If anything, it grew slightly stronger as she rose from the bed and crossed toward the hallway, and with every step her certainty crumbled a little further, replaced by a slow, creeping unease that made her hands feel cold despite the warm morning light spilling through her windows. She thought of the small pup and the way it had said her name, clean and certain, in a voice that belonged to something far older than its tiny body suggested. She thought of the words it had tried to give her just before the dream folded in on itself. Words about morning, about a door, about not being ready. Words she had not managed to catch in full and now feared she might need badly. She stood at the end of the hallway for a long moment, one hand resting against the cool plaster of the wall, gathering the nerve to walk the last few steps into her kitchen and see for herself whether her waking life had somehow begun to answer to the same strange rules as her dreams. She had not bought a cabbage in weeks. Mara padded down the hallway on bare feet, her heart still not fully settled from the dream, and stopped in the doorway of her kitchen. On the counter, exactly where she remembered a fruit bowl usually sitting, was a cabbage. It was pale green, round, its outer leaves peeled back and folded neatly, almost exactly like the one from the clearing, except there was no lace veil resting on top of it, no red thread wound around its base, just a plain, ordinary cabbage, sitting where it had no business being. She stood frozen for a long moment, one hand braced against the doorframe, running through every possible explanation her mind could produce. She lived alone. She had lived alone for 3 years, ever since she moved into this small rented house at the edge of Ashwell Hollow, a town so small that everyone seemed to know everyone else's business before they knew it themselves. She had not ordered groceries. She had not gone to the market. She had certainly not bought a cabbage, an item she rarely cooked with and never kept in her kitchen. She crossed the room slowly, as though the vegetable might do something unexpected if she moved too fast, and picked it up. It was cool and slightly damp, heavier than she expected, entirely solid, entirely real. There was no trick to it, no illusion. It was simply there. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she nearly dropped the cabbage in surprise. It was a message from her sister, Grace, asking if she wanted to get coffee before her shift at the clinic started. Mara stared at the screen for a moment, grateful for something ordinary to focus on, and typed back a quick yes, then set the cabbage down and reached for her kettle instead, needing tea more than she needed answers right that second. While the water heated, she opened her laptop and typed the words, "Wolf Pups Wedding Cabbage Dream Meaning," into the search bar, immediately feeling foolish as she did it. The results that came back were a scattered mess of dream interpretation sites, forums about lucid dreaming, and one oddly specific blog post about Eastern European folklore involving marriage rituals between animals and harvest symbols, meant to represent the joining of instinct and abundance. She read the post twice, her tea going cold in her hands, and felt a strange chill settle over her, because none of what she read explained why the objects from her dream had somehow followed her out of sleep and into her kitchen. By the time she reached the small cafe on Willow Street, Grace was already seated at their usual table near the window, 2 coffees in front of her, steam curling up from both cups. Grace had always been the practical one between them, the one who kept lists and schedules, and rarely let her imagination run further than it needed to, which was exactly why Mara had chosen to tell her about the dream in the first place. She needed someone to talk her down from whatever spiral she was quietly building inside her own head. She slid into the chair across from her sister and wrapped both hands around the warm cup before speaking, and once she started, the whole story came tumbling out faster than she intended. The clearing, the pups, the enormous silver wolf, the veiled cabbage, the small pup that had said her name in a voice far too old for its body, and finally, almost sheepishly, the cabbage sitting on her kitchen counter that morning, with no explanation at all. Grace listened without interrupting, her eyebrows slowly climbing higher as the story went on, and when Mara finally finished, she let out a low whistle and leaned back in her chair. She admitted it was strange, stranger than any dream Mara had described to her before, but she offered the obvious explanations first, the way she always did. Maybe Mara had bought the cabbage herself and simply forgotten, tired after a long week at the design studio where she worked. Maybe a neighbor had left it as some odd, well-meaning gift and never mentioned it. Maybe her mind had simply built the entire dream around a half-remembered errand from days earlier. Mara wanted to believe any of those explanations, she really did, but something about the certainty in the small pup's voice when it said her name refused to let her settle into easy answers, and she found herself shaking her head before Grace even finished speaking. Grace studied her for a moment, then softened, reaching across the table to squeeze her sister's hand. She reminded Mara that their grandmother, long before she passed, used to tell strange old stories about the forest at the edge of town, stories involving wolves that were not quite wolves, and debts that had to be repaid to the land itself. Mara had heard fragments of these stories as a child, always half asleep by the fire, never paying close enough attention to remember the details, and now she found herself desperately wishing she had. Grace suggested, half joking, that if Mara wanted real answers instead of internet forums, she should visit old Henry at the town library. Henry had spent decades collecting local history, oral traditions, half-forgotten legends about Greymore Wood, the ancient forest that bordered Ashwell Hollow on its northern edge. If anyone could make sense of a dream this specific, this strange, it would be him. Mara finished her coffee with new purpose forming behind her uncertainty, and after saying goodbye to Grace, who had to rush off to her shift, she found herself walking not toward her own house, but toward the library instead, the cabbage still sitting untouched on her kitchen counter, waiting for her return. The library was a squat brick building, with ivy creeping up one side, and inside it smelled of old paper and furniture polish, quiet in a way that felt deliberate rather than empty. Henry sat behind the front desk, a thin man in his 70s with wire glasses perched on the end of his nose, sorting through a stack of returned books with the unhurried patience of someone who had all the time in the world. Mara approached the desk and hesitated, unsure exactly how to phrase the question crowding her mind, and Henry looked up at her with the kind of attentive curiosity that suggested he was used to strange questions from the people of this small town. She asked, as plainly as she could manage, whether he knew anything about old stories involving wolves and weddings near Greymore Wood. The moment the words left her mouth, something shifted in Henry's expression, a flicker of recognition that told her she had asked the right question, perhaps the exact right question, though she had no idea what answer was coming. Henry set down the books he had been sorting and studied her for a long moment before speaking, and when he finally did, his voice had dropped into something quieter, more careful, the tone people use when a topic matters more than they want to admit out loud. He told her that Greymore Wood had always been considered different from other patches of forest around Ashwell Hollow, older somehow, in a way that had nothing to do with the age of its trees. Families who had lived in the hollow for generations spoke of a pact, an old agreement between the people of the town and something that lived deep within the wood, something that kept the land fertile and the seasons steady, in exchange for a ritual of renewal, performed once in every generation. Mara's pulse quickened. She asked what the ritual involved, though some part of her already suspected the answer before Henry gave it. He told her the details had been lost over the years, twisted through generations of retelling, until no one alive truly remembered the specifics. But the surviving fragments always mentioned 4 young wolves, a great elder wolf they called the Alpha King, and a harvest offering, meant to symbolize the union between wild instinct and human sustenance. The specific offering, he admitted, had varied across different accounts, sometimes described as grain, sometimes as fruit, and in at least one old journal entry he had personally transcribed decades ago, described specifically as a cabbage, chosen for its many layers, meant to represent the many generations bound together by the promise. Mara felt the blood drain from her face. She had not mentioned the cabbage, she had only asked about wolves and weddings, and yet Henry had produced the exact detail from her dream without any prompting at all. She asked him, her voice barely steady, what happened if the ritual was never performed, if the generation responsible for renewing the pact failed to complete it. Henry's expression grew graver, and he admitted that the old journals were less clear on that point, mentioning only vague warnings about the land turning hostile, the forest closing in on itself, and a general sense of misfortune settling over the hollow like a slow illness. He told her most people in town dismissed the old stories entirely now, treating them as nothing more than colorful folklore, meant to entertain children on autumn evenings. But as Mara walked home that afternoon, the cabbage still waiting in her kitchen, the small pup's voice still echoing faintly in her memory, she found she could not dismiss any of it quite so easily. Something had reached across the boundary of sleep and left a physical object in her waking life. Something wanted her attention, urgently, and whatever it was, she had the distinct and unsettling feeling that it was not finished with her yet. That night, Mara placed the cabbage in her refrigerator, unwilling to throw it away, and equally unwilling to look at it, sitting out on her counter, any longer than necessary. She told herself she would decide what to do with it once she understood more, though even as she thought it, she recognized how strange it was to be making decisions about a vegetable as though it were evidence in a case she was slowly building. Sleep did not come easily. She lay awake long after midnight, staring at the crack in her ceiling, replaying every detail Henry had shared with her, turning the phrase, renewal of the pact, over and over in her mind. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were mercifully quiet, Ordinary, in the way dreams usually were, and she woke the next morning almost relieved, as though whatever force had reached into her sleep before had chosen, for now, to leave her alone. That relief lasted exactly until she stepped outside to walk to work and found 3 crows perched along her fence, unmoving, watching her with a stillness that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Crows were common enough around Ashwell Hollow, but something about the way these 3 sat in a perfect, even row, heads turned toward her in unison, made the hair on her arms rise all over again. She hurried past them without looking back, telling herself firmly that birds did not have intentions, that this was simply her mind projecting meaning onto ordinary behavior because she was primed to see significance everywhere now. At the design studio where she worked, laying out advertisements and small business branding for clients across 3 counties, she found it difficult to concentrate. Her co-worker, a cheerful young woman named Ivy who sat at the desk beside hers, noticed her distraction almost immediately and asked, with genuine concern, whether everything was all right. Mara hesitated, unsure how much to share, but something about Ivy's open, curious face made her decide to tell at least part of the story, leaving out the more unbelievable details about the cabbage appearing in her kitchen. She described the dream simply, the forest, the wolves, the strange sense of ceremony, and watched Ivy's expression shift from polite interest into something more focused, more alert. Ivy told her that her own grandmother had grown up on the outskirts of Ashwell Hollow, close to the edge of Graymore Wood, and had always refused to let anyone in the family cut down trees near the property line, insisting that certain parts of the wood were not meant to be disturbed. Ivy admitted she had always assumed this was simply an old woman's superstition, the kind every family seemed to carry a version of, but hearing Mara describe her dream in such vivid, specific detail made her reconsider. She suggested Mara speak with a woman named Charlotte, a retired folklore professor who had moved to Ashwell Hollow years ago, specifically because of its unusual concentration of preserved local legends, and who occasionally gave talks at the community center about the history of the wood. That evening after work, Mara found Charlotte's address through a quick search and, gathering her courage, drove out to the small cottage at the edge of town, where the professor lived alone, surrounded by an overgrown garden thick with herbs and climbing vines. Charlotte answered the door before Mara even finished knocking, as though she had been expecting a visitor, and looked at her with sharp, assessing eyes framed by silver hair, pulled back into a loose braid. Mara introduced herself and explained, somewhat awkwardly, that Ivy from the design studio had suggested she come. Charlotte studied her for a long moment, then stepped back from the doorway and invited her inside without asking a single question, as though the mere mention of the wood and Ivy's name together told her everything she needed to know about why Mara had come. Inside, the cottage was cluttered with books, pressed flowers under glass, and small clay figures shaped like animals that Mara did not recognize from anywhere in the natural world. Charlotte gestured for her to sit at a small wooden table and poured 2 cups of tea, without asking if Mara wanted any, then settled into the chair across from her and waited, hands folded, for Mara to begin. Mara told her everything this time, the full dream from beginning to end, the cabbage that had appeared in her kitchen, the conversation with Henry at the library, the strange stillness of the crows on her fence that morning. Charlotte listened without interrupting, her expression giving away nothing, until Mara finally finished and fell silent, waiting anxiously for some kind of response. Charlotte set down her tea and was quiet for a long moment before speaking. She told Mara that the story she had just described matched, almost precisely, an old regional tradition that predated the town of Ashwell Hollow itself, a tradition that had nearly vanished from written record, because those who once practiced it had been careful never to write down the full details, believing that certain knowledge was meant to be carried only through direct experience, passed from one generation to the next, through dream and memory, rather than paper and ink. She explained that Graymore Wood had long been considered a boundary place, neither fully wild nor fully tamed, home to something the old stories called guardians, spirits bound to the land in the shape of wolves, who maintained a careful balance between the forest and the town that bordered it, in exchange for protection from the deeper, harsher wilderness beyond the wood's edge, and for the steady, reliable turning of the seasons that allowed the town's crops to flourish year after year. Someone from the town was required, once each generation, to renew an old promise through a specific ceremony, one that only ever appeared to the chosen person through dreams, never through waking instruction. Mara's hands tightened around her teacup. She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, why it would be her, out of everyone in Ashwell Hollow, that the dream had chosen. Charlotte's expression softened slightly, and she asked, in return, whether Mara's family had lived in the hollow for many generations. Mara confirmed that they had, that her grandmother and great-grandmother had both been born in the same house at the edge of town, a house that had passed down through the women of the family for as long as anyone could remember. Charlotte nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. She explained that the old stories always specified the guardianship passed through particular bloodlines, families who had lived closest to the wood for the longest time, families whose ancestors had likely made the original promise generations ago, long before anyone alive today had been born. It was not random chance that had selected Mara for this dream. It was inheritance, whether she had ever asked for it or not. Mara sat back in her chair, feeling suddenly unmoored, as though the ground beneath her ordinary life had quietly shifted while she wasn't looking. She asked what would happen if she simply ignored the dream, if she treated it as nothing more than an unusually vivid product of an overactive imagination, and went on with her life exactly as before. Charlotte's answer came slowly, carefully, as though she were choosing each word with great deliberation. She said that according to the oldest fragments of the tradition she had studied, ignoring the call was not without consequence. The pact existed to maintain balance, and balance, once disturbed, did not simply restore itself. If the ceremony went unperformed, the old stories suggested the wood itself would begin to change, growing more insular, more hostile to those who wandered too close, and the protection it had long provided the town would begin to fade, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. Mara asked, almost desperately now, what exactly she was supposed to do, since the dream itself had never fully explained the actual ceremony, only shown her fragments of what appeared to be its ancient, symbolic form. Charlotte admitted she did not know the complete answer, that no written record fully preserved the specific actions required, but she suggested, gently, that the dreams themselves were likely to continue, growing clearer and more specific with each return, until Mara understood enough to act. The pups, she said, the ones who had spoken directly to her, breaking whatever barrier normally separated dream from dreamer, were almost certainly meant to guide her, piece by piece, toward whatever she needed to do. As Mara drove home that night under a sky thick with early stars, she found herself glancing repeatedly toward the dark tree line of Greymore Wood, visible even from the main road that cut through town, and for the first time in her life, the familiar silhouette of those trees against the night sky did not feel comforting or ordinary. It felt like something was waiting there, patient and ancient, watching the road, watching her car pass, waiting for her to finally understand what it needed her to do. Before Mara left the cottage, Charlotte had risen from the table and disappeared briefly into a back room, returning with a small clay figure, shaped like a wolf, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling. She pressed it into Mara's palm without much explanation, only saying that it had belonged to her own mother, who had once studied the same old traditions, and always kept some small token of the wood close at hand during the weeks leading up to a renewal. She told Mara to carry it with her in the days ahead, not because it held any power of its own, but because it might help steady her nerves when the dreams grew harder to bear. Mara had thanked her, turning the small clay wolf over in her fingers, its rough edges strangely comforting against her skin, and asked one final question before stepping out into the cooling evening air. She asked whether Charlotte herself had ever seen the guardians, whether anyone outside the chosen bloodline had ever witnessed the ceremony directly. Charlotte's expression had grown distant then, almost wistful, and she admitted that she had spent decades studying every scrap of the old tradition, without ever once glimpsing the wood's true residents herself, that the wolves apparently chose their own witnesses, and that whatever Mara experienced in the nights ahead would likely remain hers alone to carry, shared only with those she trusted enough to bring along in person. She parked in her driveway and sat for a long moment before going inside, her hands still resting on the steering wheel, her mind circling endlessly around Charlotte's words. Inheritance, bloodline, balance. She thought of her grandmother, gone now for over a decade, and wondered, with a chill that had nothing to do with the cool evening air, whether her grandmother had once sat in a car exactly like this, staring at exactly the same tree line, carrying exactly the same impossible weight. The small clay wolf sat on the passenger seat beside her, its worn little face turned toward the windshield, and before going inside, Mara slipped it into her jacket pocket, deciding she would keep it close from that point forward, whatever the nights ahead demanded of her. Mara did not fall asleep easily again that night, and when she finally did, the dream returned with a suddenness that felt less like drifting off and more like being pulled through a door she had not chosen to open. She was back in the clearing, though something had shifted since her last visit. The moon hung lower in the sky, closer to the treetops, and its light had taken on a faint reddish tint that made the whole scene feel more urgent, less serene than before. The 4 pups were already waiting when she arrived, standing in a tight cluster near the stone slab, and this time they did not ignore her the way they had the first time. All 4 turned toward her the moment she appeared, their gold eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her want to step backward, though her legs, once again, refused to obey her. The smallest pup, the one who had spoken her name before, approached first, moving with a purpose that felt entirely different from the slow, ceremonial pace of the earlier dream. It stopped directly in front of her and sat back on its haunches, looking up at her the way a patient teacher looks at a student who has not yet finished their assignment. It spoke, and this time its voice came through clearly, without the fragmenting and slipping that had swallowed its words before. It told her that the wedding she had witnessed was not a completed ceremony, but an unfinished one, a ritual that had been performed for generations by the women of her family, and that time was growing shorter than it had ever been before. It told her the wood was already beginning to feel the strain of the broken promise, and that something from beyond its borders, something the pups referred to only as the hunger, was pressing against the edges of the forest with increasing force, testing for weaknesses the way water tests for cracks in stone. Mara wanted to ask what the hunger was, wanted to ask 100 questions at once, but the pup continued before she could form the words, telling her that 3 more nights remained before the moon reached its fullest point, and that the ceremony had to be completed by then, in the waking world, not merely witnessed in dreams. She asked, finally finding her voice, what she needed to do, what actions the strange ritual actually required beyond the symbolic gestures she had already seen. The pup told her she needed to bring a cabbage, freshly cut, to the heart of Greymore Wood, on the night the moon reached fullness, and there she needed to speak the old words of renewal aloud, words that had been passed down through her family for generations, words that lived somewhere in her memory, even if she did not yet know she carried them. Mara felt a flare of panic at this. She told the pup, her voice rising with desperation, that she did not know any old words, that no one had ever taught her a ritual, or a chant, or anything resembling what it was describing, that her grandmother had died when she was still a teenager, long before anyone thought to pass down family secrets of this magnitude. The pup's gold eyes softened slightly, and it told her, with something almost like gentleness, that the words were not learned in the way she was thinking of learning, memorized from a page or repeated after a teacher. They were inherited, buried deep in blood and memory, and would surface when the moment demanded them, the way a swimmer who has not swum in years still remembers how to move through water when thrown suddenly into a lake. Before Mara could ask anything further, the great silver wolf appeared at the tree line, and this time, he did not walk calmly into the clearing the way he had before. He moved with urgency, his massive frame low and tense, and behind him, the shadows between the trees seemed to writhe and shift in a way that had nothing to do with wind or moonlight. Something was pressing in from beyond the clearing, some presence Mara could not see clearly but could feel, a cold, hungry pressure that made her chest tighten with primal fear. The 4 pups turned as one to face the tree line, hackles raised, small bodies tense despite their size, and the smallest one, still closest to Mara, spoke one final time before the dream began to dissolve around her. It told her 3 nights, and then it told her to hurry, and then the moonlight fractured into 1,000 fragments of light, and Mara woke, gasping in her own bed, her sheets damp with sweat, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She lay still for several minutes, staring at the ceiling, trying to steady her breathing, and when she finally reached for her phone to check the time, she noticed the date glowing on the screen, and felt her stomach drop. 3 nights. The pup had said 3 nights until the moon reached fullness, and a quick search confirmed what some instinctive part of her had already suspected. The full moon was indeed only 3 days away. She spent that morning in a fog, going through the motions of her routine without truly registering any of it, until a knock at her door pulled her out of her thoughts entirely. She opened it to find a man she recognized vaguely from around the neighborhood, tall and broad-shouldered, with sandy hair, and an easy, apologetic smile, standing on her porch with a small toolbox in one hand. He introduced himself as Oliver, explaining that he lived 2 houses down and had noticed her fence leaning after last week's storm, and offered, in the casual way of someone used to helping neighbors without being asked, to fix it for her free of charge, since he had the materials left over from his own repairs. Mara, still distracted and hollowed out from the dream, thanked him and let him get to work, watching from her kitchen window as he moved efficiently along the fence line. When he finished nearly an hour later, she brought him a glass of water as a small thank you, and something about his calm, grounded presence made her decide, almost without meaning to ask him whether he had ever heard strange stories about Greymore Wood. She expected him to laugh it off, the way most reasonable people would, but instead his expression grew thoughtful, and he admitted that his own family had lived near the wood for 3 generations, and that his grandfather had always refused to let anyone hunt or camp anywhere near its center, insisting there was something in there that did not appreciate visitors. Encouraged, Mara found herself telling him a shortened version of her dreams, watching his face carefully for any sign of doubt or disbelief. Instead, Oliver listened with quiet seriousness, and when she finished, he told her something that made the hair on her arms rise all over again. He said that just last week, a survey crew had been spotted at the edge of Greymore Wood, marking trees with bright orange tape, and that rumors were already spreading through town about a development company interested in clearing a section of the forest for a new highway extension, meant to connect Ashwell Hollow to the larger interstate 2 counties over. Mara felt the pieces of a much larger picture beginning to shift into place in her mind, though she could not yet see the whole shape of it clearly. She asked Oliver if he knew the name of the company behind the survey crew, and he told her it belonged to a firm called Pierce Development, run by a man named Daniel Pierce, who had already held 2 town meetings promising jobs and economic growth, in exchange for the town council's approval to begin clearing the outer edge of the wood within the month. The timing felt impossible to ignore, the dreams growing more urgent, the moon approaching fullness. A company with orange tape and bulldozers waiting at the edge of the very forest the old stories claimed needed protecting. Mara thanked Oliver for his help with the fence and for the information, and after he left, she stood alone in her kitchen for a long time, staring out the window toward the distant dark line of trees, feeling the shape of the danger sharpening with every passing hour, though she still did not fully understand what she was meant to do about any of it, or whether she would manage to figure it out before the 3 nights ran out. That afternoon, Mara drove out to her grandmother's old house, the same house where her mother had grown up, and where Mara herself had spent countless summer afternoons as a child, chasing fireflies through the tall grass, while the adults talked quietly on the porch. Her uncle Felix still lived there, maintaining the property out of a mixture of habit and sentiment, and when Mara called ahead to ask if she could come look through the attic for old family belongings, he agreed readily enough, though he sounded puzzled by the sudden request. The attic smelled of dust and cedar, and boxes were stacked in uneven towers along the sloped walls, labeled in handwriting that had faded over the decades into something barely legible. Mara worked methodically, opening box after box, sorting through old photographs, yellowed letters, and articles of clothing too delicate to have survived if not carefully packed away. Felix left her to it after bringing up a flashlight and a bottle of water, telling her to holler if she needed anything, and Mara worked in near silence for over an hour, before she found what she had been searching for, without fully admitting to herself that she was searching for anything specific at all. Tucked inside a small cedar chest at the very back of the attic, wrapped in a piece of faded blue cloth, she found a journal bound in cracked brown leather, its pages soft and worn from handling. The handwriting inside belonged, unmistakably, to her grandmother, the same careful, looping script Mara remembered from birthday cards and grocery lists scrawled decades ago. She sat down right there on the dusty attic floor and began to read, her flashlight beam trembling slightly, as her hands shook with a mixture of excitement and dread. The early entries were ordinary enough, notes about the weather, small complaints about neighbors, brief mentions of Mara's mother as a child. But partway through the journal, the entries shifted in tone entirely, becoming more private, more careful, as though her grandmother had begun writing them specifically to be found by someone else, someday, someone who would need exactly this information. Her grandmother wrote of a dream, nearly identical to the one Mara had experienced, describing 4 wolf pups and a great silver elder, describing a cabbage dressed in lace, describing a clearing, deep within Greymore Wood, that existed somewhere between the ordinary forest and something older, something that did not quite belong to the same world as the rest of the Hollow. She wrote of performing the ceremony herself, decades ago, and of the fear and confusion she had carried in the days leading up to it. Fear that mirrored, almost exactly, what Mara had been feeling since her own dream began. And then, near the final pages of the journal, Mara found what she had truly been hoping for. Her grandmother had written out, in careful, deliberate script, the words of renewal themselves, along with a note explaining that she had chosen to write them down against the old tradition of oral memory alone, worried that the family's connection to the wood had grown thin enough over the generations that the words might not surface naturally in her daughter's mind, or her granddaughter's, when the time eventually came. Mara read the words over and over by flashlight, her lips moving silently as she mouthed the unfamiliar syllables, feeling a strange, distant sense of recognition stirring somewhere beneath conscious thought, as though she had heard these exact words once, long ago, perhaps whispered to her as an infant, before she was old enough to form memories of her own. It was not quite the total blankness she expected. Something in her chest responded to the shape of the words, some old resonance she could not fully explain. She carefully tore the relevant pages free from the journal, folding them gently and tucking them into her jacket pocket, and made her way back downstairs to find Felix in the kitchen, brewing a pot of coffee. She asked him, as casually as she could manage, whether their grandmother had ever mentioned strange dreams or old family traditions connected to Greymore Wood. Felix's expression grew distant for a moment, and he admitted that their grandmother had always been protective of the wood in ways that seemed excessive to everyone else in the family, refusing to let anyone build even a small shed near its border, insisting that certain patches of land were not meant to be disturbed. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he had heard rumors just that morning about the Pierce Development Survey crew expanding their marked territory overnight, moving further into the wood than anyone had expected, and that several longtime residents had already begun raising concerns at the general store about how quickly the whole process seemed to be moving. Mara thanked her uncle, promised to explain everything once she understood it better herself, and drove straight from the old house to the town hall, where a public information session about the highway extension project was scheduled to begin within the hour. She had not planned to attend, had not even known about the meeting until Felix mentioned it, but something in her gut told her she needed to see Daniel Pierce in person, needed to understand exactly how quickly this threat to the wood was actually moving. The town hall was more crowded than she expected, filled with familiar faces from around Ashwell Hollow, some looking hopeful at the prospect of new jobs, others looking wary and unconvinced. Daniel Pierce stood at the front of the room beside a large presentation board showing renderings of the proposed highway extension. A confident, well-dressed man in his 40s, with the practiced smile of someone used to selling optimistic futures to skeptical crowds. Mara found a seat near the back and listened as he spoke, describing economic growth, new jobs, faster commutes to the larger cities beyond the county line, and watched as he gestured toward the map behind him, where a wide red line cut directly through the heart of Greymore Wood, precisely through the section Mara now suspected, with growing certainty, contained the clearing from her dreams. When the floor opened for questions, several residents raised concerns about wildlife displacement and environmental impact, and Daniel Pierce answered each one smoothly, citing studies and mitigation plans that sounded reasonable enough on the surface, though something in his tone, a slight impatience beneath the polish, told Mara he had answered these same questions many times before, and had grown tired of pretending to take them seriously. She raised her own hand eventually, surprising herself with the sudden boldness, and asked simply how soon construction crews planned to begin clearing trees. Daniel Pierce's smile flickered for just a moment before he answered, stating that initial clearing was scheduled to begin within the week, pending final council approval expected at their next scheduled vote, which, Mara realized with a cold drop in her stomach, was set to occur only 2 days from now, the very day before the full moon reached its peak. She left the meeting with her pulse racing, the folded pages from her grandmother's journal pressed against her chest inside her jacket pocket like a small, fragile promise. The timeline had collapsed into something far tighter than she had imagined. She had the words now, or at least the shape of them, but she still did not fully understand what completing the ceremony would actually require of her. whether reciting old words and placing a cabbage in a clearing would be enough to stop machinery and legal approvals, and a man like Daniel Pierce, who clearly had no intention of slowing down for anyone's inherited family superstition. On her way out of the town hall, Mara passed close enough to Daniel Pierce to hear him speaking quietly with one of his assistants, a younger man clutching a tablet loaded with site maps and permit paperwork. She slowed her steps just enough to catch the tail end of their conversation, and what she heard sent a fresh wave of urgency through her chest. The assistant was confirming that the clearing crews had already been placed on standby, ready to mobilize the very morning after council approval, meaning the machinery meant to tear into Greymore Wood could be running within hours of the vote rather than days, as the earlier public timeline had suggested. Daniel Pierce nodded along, unbothered, already turning his attention to his phone, and Mara felt a hot flash of anger rise beneath her fear. Anger at how easily he seemed to treat the wood as nothing more than an obstacle standing between his company and a tidy profit margin. She lingered near the parking lot afterward, watching him climb into a sleek black car and pull away without a second glance toward the building full of residents he had just spent an hour reassuring, and something about his easy indifference hardened Mara's resolve in a way that felt entirely new. She had spent the last several days frightened, uncertain, chasing half-understood fragments of family legend through libraries and cottages and old attics. Watching Daniel Pierce dismiss an entire town's concerns with a practiced smile made her realize, with sudden clarity, that whatever the old stories demanded of her, she intended to see it through, not only because some ancient promise bound her by blood, but because the wood deserved better than to be reduced to a line item on someone else's balance sheet. Driving home beneath a sky just beginning to darken toward evening, Mara glanced again toward the distant tree line of Greymore Wood, and for the first time, she thought she saw something moving along its edge, low and quick, gone before she could be certain she had seen anything at all. She gripped the steering wheel tighter and pressed forward, the folded pages warm against her chest, the moon 2 nights from full, and the wood, she was now entirely certain, was running out of time. By the time Mara reached home, the sky had darkened into deep blue, and she found herself unable to sit still, pacing her small living room with the folded pages from her grandmother's journal spread across her coffee table. She read the old words aloud, quietly at first, then with more confidence, feeling the strange, half-familiar shapes of them settle more comfortably on her tongue with each repetition, the way an old song grows easier to sing the more times you hum it, even if you never learned the words on purpose. Her phone rang while she was in the middle of her 4th attempt, and she answered without checking the screen, distracted, only realizing after the fact that it was Grace calling to check in. Her sister's voice carried a note of concern the moment Mara answered, and Mara realized, too late, that she must have sounded strange, breathless, caught in the middle of chanting words that made no sense out of context. She tried to explain, stumbling over her own account of the day, the journal in the attic, the meeting at town hall, the survey crews already marking trees deeper into the wood than anyone expected. Grace listened, but the warmth in her voice cooled slightly as Mara spoke, and when she finally responded, her tone carried the careful, measured quality of someone trying not to alarm a person they were quietly beginning to worry about. Grace suggested, gently, that Mara had been under a great deal of stress lately, between the dreams and the strange coincidences, and now the added pressure of the development project, and that perhaps she should consider talking to someone. Not necessarily about wolves and cabbages specifically, but simply about the anxiety clearly building inside her. Mara felt a flash of frustration at being doubted, though she understood, even as the emotion rose in her chest, that she would have reacted exactly the same way if their positions were reversed. She thanked her sister for calling, promised she was fine, and ended the call feeling more isolated than she had before it began. She spent the rest of the evening alone with the journal pages, practicing the words until she could recite them from memory, without glancing down, and when exhaustion finally pulled her toward sleep sometime after midnight, she went willingly, hoping the dream would return and offer her some further guidance before the deadline closed in completely. It did return, though this time it felt different from the start, thinner somehow, as though she were viewing the clearing through frosted glass rather than standing directly within it. The 4 pups were there, along with the great silver wolf, but their movements seemed strained, their gold eyes dimmer than before, and when the smallest pup approached her, its voice came through weaker, more effortful, as though speaking to her across this particular dream cost it something it could no longer easily afford. It told her the hunger pressing against the wood's edges had grown stronger overnight, fed, it seemed, by the disturbance already caused by the survey crews cutting through underbrush and marking trees for removal. It told her that every tree cut, every root disturbed, weakened the old boundary further, and that she needed to complete the ceremony as soon as possible, ideally before the moon reached fullness rather than waiting for the exact peak, since the wood's strength was fading faster than the old traditions had ever anticipated. Mara asked, with rising panic, whether that meant she needed to act the very next night, instead of waiting the additional day she had assumed she had. The pup's gold eyes, dimmer now than she remembered from before, held hers steadily, and it confirmed her fear. Tomorrow night, it told her. The ceremony needed to happen tomorrow night, and she needed to find her own way into the heart of Greymore Wood. Since the survey crews had already begun blocking off the main trails with warning tape and temporary fencing, in preparation for the clearing crews expected to arrive within days. She woke before dawn, her mind already racing through logistics, and reached for her phone to call Oliver, the only person besides Charlotte who had taken her seriously, without immediately suggesting she needed professional help. He answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep, and listened without interruption, as she explained, as calmly as she could manage, that she needed his help getting into the heart of the wood that very night, past the fencing the survey crews had put up, before construction crews arrived and made the whole effort impossible. Oliver did not hesitate the way she feared he might. He told her he knew an old logging trail that wound around the back side of the property, one his grandfather had used for decades before the main roads existed, a path that would let them bypass the fenced perimeter entirely and reach the heart of the wood from an angle the survey crews likely hadn't considered blocking yet. He offered to meet her that evening, once the sun began to set, and Mara felt a rush of gratitude so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes, grateful beyond words, that at least one person believed her enough to help, rather than simply worry about her. The day passed in a blur of preparation. She bought a fresh cabbage from the small grocery on Main Street, ignoring the curious glance the cashier gave her when she paid for a single item and hurried out without further explanation. She packed a bag with a flashlight, her grandmother's journal pages, a warm jacket for the cooling autumn evening, and, after a moment of hesitation, a small kitchen knife, uncertain whether the ceremony would require cutting the cabbage open in some specific way, but unwilling to arrive unprepared. She tried calling Grace once more in the afternoon, wanting to smooth over the tension from the night before, but the call went to voicemail, and Mara left a brief message saying only that she loved her and would explain everything soon, a message that, listening back to it, sounded far more ominous than she intended. As the sun began sinking toward the western hills, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and violet, Mara drove to the agreed meeting point, near the old logging trail, her cabbage and journal pages secured carefully in her bag, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and stubborn determination. Oliver was already waiting when she arrived, dressed warmly, a flashlight of his own clipped to his belt, and he greeted her with a steady, reassuring nod that did more to calm her nerves than any words could have managed. Together, they started toward the tree line, as the last light drained from the sky, the dark bulk of Greymore Wood rising ahead of them, like a wall between the world Mara had always known, and whatever waited, patient and ancient, at its very heart. Neither of them spoke much as they walked, the weight of what lay ahead settling over both of them, in heavy, wordless silence, broken only by the crunch of dry leaves beneath their boots, and the distant, mournful call of something moving unseen through the darkening trees. The old logging trail was overgrown in places, barely visible beneath years of fallen leaves and creeping underbrush, but Oliver moved through it with the confidence of someone who had walked this path many times before, even in the deepening dark. Mara followed close behind him, her flashlight beam bouncing across roots and low branches, her senses sharpened by a nervous energy she could not fully shake no matter how steadily she tried to breathe. They had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes, when Oliver suddenly raised a hand, signaling her to stop, and pointed toward a faint orange glow filtering through the trees ahead. He kept his voice low as he explained that the survey crews sometimes left temporary lighting near their equipment overnight to discourage anyone from tampering with their markers, and that they would need to swing wide around that section to avoid drawing the attention of whoever might be stationed there as a night watch. They cut off the main trail, moving carefully through denser brush, branches catching at Mara's jacket and hair as she pushed forward, her heart hammering with the fear of discovery layered on top of the deeper fear of what waited for them further ahead. After several tense minutes of careful, quiet movement, the orange glow faded behind them, and Oliver led her back toward what remained of the old trail, his relief visible, even in the dim moonlight, beginning to filter down through the canopy above. The forest around them grew steadily thicker and darker as they continued deeper, the trees pressing closer together than Mara remembered from the edges of the wood she had occasionally glimpsed from the road. The air itself seemed to change, growing cooler and heavier, carrying a mineral scent she could not quite place, something like wet stone mixed with the sharp green smell of crushed leaves. She found herself glancing frequently over her shoulder, certain more than once that she had seen movement at the edge of her flashlight's beam, though each time she looked directly at the spot, nothing was there. Oliver noticed her unease and slowed his pace slightly, walking closer beside her rather than ahead, and admitted, in a low voice, that he felt it too. A sense of being watched that had nothing to do with imagination, and everything to do with some instinct buried deep in the oldest part of the human brain, the part that once needed to sense predators in the dark, long before conscious thought could process danger. They pressed on, and perhaps another quarter hour into the walk, Mara caught sight of something that made her stop dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. Ahead of them, perhaps 30 feet off the trail, a pair of eyes reflected back the pale moonlight, low to the ground, unmoving, watching them with a stillness that felt entirely deliberate. A moment later, a second pair of eyes appeared beside the first, and then a third, until Mara counted 4 sets in total, arranged in a loose cluster among the shadows of the underbrush. Oliver's hand found her arm, steadying her, and he whispered that they were likely looking at real wolves, not the spectral figures from her dream, but flesh and blood animals that called this forest home. Animals that, according to every story he had ever heard growing up near the wood, rarely if ever approached humans directly, preferring instead to observe from a careful distance and let people pass unbothered, as long as they respected the boundaries of the land. Mara stared at the 4 sets of eyes, her pulse pounding, and slowly, one by one, the shapes attached to those eyes stepped forward, just enough to become visible in the moonlight. They were smaller than she expected, young wolves rather than fully grown adults, their movements careful and measured rather than aggressive, and something about the way they held themselves, upright and alert, reminded her with a jolt of recognition of the 4 pups from her dream, though these were larger, more solid, undeniably real, in a way the dream versions had never quite managed to be. One of the 4 took several more steps forward, closing perhaps half the distance between itself and where Mara stood frozen on the trail, and tilted its head in a gesture so specifically familiar that Mara felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes. It was the same tilt of the head the smallest dream pup had used each time it studied her, curious and patient, waiting for her to understand something just beyond the reach of easy comprehension. Oliver, to his credit, did not panic or reach for anything resembling a weapon, though Mara noticed his body had gone tense and alert beside her. He whispered that they should continue moving forward slowly, without sudden movement, trusting that the wolves, if they meant harm, would have already acted rather than simply watching from the shadows. Mara took a slow breath and continued walking, keeping her eyes forward but acutely aware of the 4 shapes moving parallel to them now, pacing the humans through the underbrush at a respectful distance, neither approaching closer nor falling back, as though they had been assigned the task of escort rather than threat. The realization settled over her slowly as they walked, a strange, steadying calm replacing some of her earlier fear. These were not random wolves who happened to cross their path by coincidence. They were waiting for her, had likely been waiting for some time, and their presence now felt less like danger and more like confirmation that she was moving in exactly the right direction. At one point, the trail narrowed sharply between 2 large boulders, forcing Mara and Oliver to walk single file, and for a brief, breathless moment, the 4 wolves vanished entirely from view, swallowed by the dense undergrowth on either side. Mara felt her chest tighten with the sudden absence of their watchful presence, a fear she had not expected to feel, missing the company of creatures that, only minutes earlier, had made her pulse race with a very different kind of alarm. She realized, passing through the gap in the boulders, that she had already begun to trust them, some deep instinctive part of her recognizing kinship where logic offered none. The wolves reappeared on the far side of the boulders exactly where she hoped they would, and one of them, slightly bolder than the rest, drew close enough that Mara could hear the soft, steady rhythm of its breathing over the crunch of leaves beneath her own boots. She resisted the urge to reach out a hand, some deep caution warning her that whatever bond existed between them was not the kind meant to be tested with casual affection. Not yet. Not until whatever business had drawn them together tonight had been properly settled. Oliver, walking close beside her, murmured that his grandfather used to say, the wood chose its own company, and that a person either belonged within its boundaries or they did not, with very little room for anything uncertain in between. Mara found herself wondering, as they continued deeper into the trees, which category she had belonged to before tonight, and which category she belonged to now, and whether the answer to that question would look any different once the sun rose again over Ashwell Hollow. The trail began to slope gently downward, the trees around them growing taller and older, their trunks wider than any Mara had seen elsewhere in the wood, their canopy so dense overhead that even the moonlight struggled to penetrate fully to the forest floor. Oliver checked his compass by flashlight and confirmed they were nearing the coordinates he estimated matched the rough center of the property, the heart of Greymoor Wood, that the old logging maps his grandfather once used had always marked with a small, unexplained symbol, a circle with 4 smaller circles arranged around it, a marking neither of them had understood until this very moment. As they crested a small rise, the trees suddenly opened ahead of them into a wide, moonlit clearing, and Mara stopped walking entirely, her breath catching hard in her chest. It was the clearing from her dream, exact in every detail she could recall, down to the ancient stone slab rising from the earth at its center, pale and weathered under the silver light. The 4 young wolves that had escorted them through the forest moved ahead now, trotting into the clearing, and taking up positions at the 4 corners of the slab, exactly as their dream counterparts had done every single time Mara had witnessed the ceremony in sleep. Oliver's hand found hers in the darkness, steadying her, and together they stepped forward into the clearing, the cool night air settling around them like held breath, the ancient trees standing sentinel on every side, and somewhere beyond the tree line, deep in the darkness, Mara heard the low, distant sound of something enormous, beginning to move toward them through the shadows. The massive shape emerged from the tree line exactly as Mara remembered from her dream. Silver-furred and scarred, moving with the unhurried authority of something that had ruled this patch of earth for longer than any human record could account for. In her dream, his size had seemed almost symbolic, larger than life in the way dream figures often were. Standing in the actual clearing, watching him approach across real ground beneath a real moon, Mara realized he was, if anything, even larger than her sleeping mind had managed to conjure, his shoulders nearly level with her own chest, his eyes holding an intelligence that made her feel, for the first time in her life, truly small in the presence of something wild. Oliver's grip on her hand tightened, though he did not step back, and Mara found herself grateful beyond words for his steady presence beside her. The 4 young wolves at the corners of the slab lowered their heads as the great silver wolf passed between them, taking up a position directly before the ancient stone, and then he turned his head and looked directly at Mara, waiting. She understood, without needing to be told, that this was the moment the entire journey had been building toward. She reached into her bag with trembling hands and withdrew the cabbage she had purchased that morning, along with the folded pages from her grandmother's journal, though she found she barely needed to glance at the written words anymore, the shape of the old language settling naturally onto her tongue as she stepped forward and placed the cabbage carefully atop the stone slab. She began to speak the words her grandmother had recorded decades earlier, her voice shaking at first, then steadying as she continued, the strange syllables flowing more easily than she expected, as though some deep, inherited part of her recognized the shape of this moment, even if her conscious mind had never encountered it before. The 4 young wolves lifted their heads as she spoke, and a low, resonant hum seemed to rise from the ground itself, vibrating up through the soles of her boots. She had barely reached the midpoint of the recitation when the air around the clearing changed, growing suddenly colder, the moonlight dimming, as though something vast had passed briefly between the moon and the earth. The trees at the edge of the clearing began to sway without wind, their branches creaking and groaning, and a low sound rolled toward them from beyond the tree line, not quite a growl and not quite a moan, something hungry and vast and utterly wrong, in a way that made every instinct in Mara's body scream at her to run. The great silver wolf turned toward the sound, his hackles rising along his spine, and let out a warning howl that shook loose leaves from the nearest branches. The 4 younger wolves pressed closer together near the slab, and Oliver, beside Mara, pulled a flashlight from his belt and swept its beam toward the tree line, though the light seemed to catch nothing solid, only shifting patches of deeper darkness that moved independently of anything the beam illuminated. Mara's voice faltered, the old words catching in her throat as fear threatened to overwhelm her completely, and it was Oliver's steady hand on her shoulder, along with a soft, urgent whisper reminding her to keep going, that pulled her back from the edge of panic. She forced herself to continue speaking, louder now, pushing the words out despite the trembling in her chest, and as she did, she noticed the great silver wolf press closer to her side, positioning his massive body as a barrier between her and the writhing darkness at the tree line, as though shielding her long enough to let her finish what she had started. The pressing cold intensified, and for a moment, Mara thought she glimpsed shapes within the shifting darkness beyond the trees, something with too many limbs, moving in ways that made her stomach turn, though the image vanished the instant she tried to focus on it directly, as though her mind refused to hold the shape steady enough to fully process it. She understood, with sudden clarity, that this was the hunger the small pup had warned her about, the force that pressed against the boundaries of the wood whenever the old balance grew weak, and that it had sensed the ceremony beginning and rushed forward to interrupt it before completion. The 4 younger wolves broke from their positions at the corners of the slab and spread out along the clearing's edge, forming a loose line between the gathered humans and the writhing dark, their small bodies trembling with effort as they held their ground against something far larger than themselves. Mara felt a surge of protective fear rise in her chest at the sight, an urge to call them back, to shield them the way the great silver wolf had tried to shield her, but she understood, watching their steady, unwavering stance, that this too was part of the old bargain, each side offering what it could to hold the line until the promise was renewed. Oliver shouted something she could not fully make out over the rising howl of wind that had begun tearing through the clearing, though she caught enough of it to understand he was telling her to keep speaking, no matter what happened around her, that the words mattered more than anything else unfolding at the edges of her vision. She fixed her eyes on the split cabbage resting on the stone slab, and forced her voice steady, forced the old syllables out one after another despite the trembling in her hands, and the cold sweat gathering along her spine, refusing to let the pressing darkness win even a single second of her attention. A branch cracked somewhere close behind them, sharp as a gunshot in the tense night air, and Mara flinched but did not stop speaking, trusting Oliver to watch her back the way he had trusted her to keep faith with words she barely understood. The hungry, formless shapes at the tree line surged forward once more, testing the thin line of young wolves guarding the clearing's edge, and for one terrible instant, Mara believed the whole ceremony was about to collapse into failure, the small wolves scattering before something too vast and hungry for 4 young bodies to hold back alone. She pushed through the final lines of the recitation, her voice cracking with effort, and as she spoke the last word, she reached forward and drew the small kitchen knife from her bag, cutting a single clean line down through the center of the cabbage resting on the stone slab, exactly as some instinctive memory buried deep within her insisted was correct, splitting the layered vegetable open to reveal its pale, tightly wound heart beneath the outer leaves. The moment the blade completed its cut, the low hum rising from the ground surged into something far more powerful, a wave of warmth and light that rolled outward from the stone slab in every direction, pushing back against the cold, hungry darkness pressing in from beyond the tree line. The great silver wolf threw back his head and released a howl unlike anything Mara had heard before, deep and triumphant, and the 4 younger wolves joined him, their voices rising together into a chorus that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ancient clearing. The writhing shadows at the tree line recoiled, pulling backward into the deeper darkness of the forest, as though struck by an invisible force, and slowly, gradually, the unnatural cold began to lift from the air, replaced by the ordinary cool of an autumn night. Mara stood trembling beside the split cabbage, her chest heaving with exertion and adrenaline, and watched as the great silver wolf turned to face her directly, his ancient eyes holding hers with an expression she could only describe as gratitude, though she knew the ceremony was not yet fully complete, and something in the tense stillness of the clearing told her the night's greatest test might still lie just ahead. The great silver wolf lowered his head until his nose nearly touched the split cabbage resting on the stone slab, and then he did something Mara had not anticipated from any of her dreams. He nudged the pale, exposed heart of the vegetable gently toward her with his muzzle, pushing it across the stone until it rested directly in front of where she stood, and the smallest of the 4 younger wolves stepped forward and looked up at her with an expression that felt, unmistakably, like instruction. Mara understood, somehow, without needing words this time, that the ceremony required one final act. She reached out with careful hands and lifted the pale heart of the cabbage from the slab, and the small wolf turned and began walking toward the edge of the clearing, glancing back once to make sure she followed. Oliver moved to accompany her, but the great silver wolf shifted his massive body slightly, not blocking Oliver exactly, but making clear through posture alone that this final part of the journey belonged to Mara, and Mara alone. She followed the small wolf perhaps 20 paces into the trees at the clearing's edge, until it stopped beside a particular tree, ancient and enormous, its roots rising above the forest floor in thick, gnarled ridges. The wolf pawed gently at a patch of soft earth nestled between 2 of the largest roots, and Mara understood, kneeling down despite the cold seeping through her jeans, that she was meant to bury the cabbage's heart directly there, at the base of this specific tree, the oldest tree in a forest already ancient beyond easy counting. She dug with her bare hands, the soil surprisingly soft and yielding despite the cool autumn air, and placed the pale heart of the cabbage into the small hollow she had made, covering it carefully with the loose earth, patting it down with a reverence she could not fully explain even to herself. The moment the last of the soil settled over the buried offering, a faint warmth pulsed upward through the ground beneath her palms, gentle and brief, like the beat of some vast, sleeping heart settling back into a slower, steadier rhythm. The small wolf let out a soft, satisfied sound and turned to lead her back toward the clearing, where Oliver waited anxiously beside the great silver wolf, his relief visible the moment Mara reappeared through the trees. The atmosphere in the clearing had shifted entirely from the tense, cold dread of only minutes before, replaced now by something calm and settled, the air carrying a faint sweetness that reminded Mara distantly of rain falling on warm soil after a long dry spell. The great silver wolf approached her one final time, and though he did not speak the way the smaller pup had in her dreams, something in his steady, ancient gaze conveyed a depth of gratitude that words might have only diminished. He dipped his massive head low, almost a bow, and Mara felt tears finally spill freely down her cheeks. Exhaustion and relief, and something like grief, for a bond she had only just discovered mixing together in a wave she no longer had the strength to hold back. Oliver stepped closer and wrapped an arm gently around her shoulders, and together they watched as the great silver wolf and his 4 young companions turned and moved unhurriedly back toward the deeper heart of the forest, disappearing between the ancient trunks until the shadows swallowed them completely, leaving Mara and Oliver alone in the moonlit clearing, with only the ancient stone slab and the settling quiet of the wood for company. They did not linger long after that, both of them suddenly aware of how much of the night had already passed and how far they still needed to walk to reach the car before dawn. The return journey through the wood felt entirely different from the walk-in, the earlier tension replaced by a tired, hollowed-out calm, though Mara found herself glancing frequently at the shadows between the trees, half hoping and half fearing to catch sight of the wolves once more. They had nearly reached the edge of the property, close enough to see the faint orange glow of the survey crew's temporary lighting through the trees ahead, when Oliver suddenly grabbed her arm and pulled her down behind a fallen log, pressing a finger to his lips. Through the gap in the underbrush, Mara could make out 2 figures moving along the perimeter fence, with flashlights of their own, clearly private security hired to guard the survey equipment overnight, their beams sweeping methodically across the tree line in a pattern that suggested a scheduled patrol rather than a random check. They waited, hearts pounding, pressed low against the cold, damp ground, until the security patrol moved past their position and continued along the fence line in the opposite direction, their voices fading into indistinct murmurs before disappearing entirely. Only then did Oliver signal that it was safe to move again, and they hurried the remaining distance to the old logging trail, adrenaline propelling them forward despite the exhaustion pulling at every muscle in Mara's body. They reached the cars just as the eastern sky began to show the faintest hint of gray along the horizon, and Mara leaned against her vehicle for a long moment, catching her breath, hardly able to believe everything that had happened in the span of a single night. Oliver stood beside her, equally winded, And after a moment of silence, he asked, quietly, whether she thought it had actually worked, whether the ceremony had truly done whatever it was meant to do. Mara did not have a certain answer, not yet, but something in her chest felt different than it had before they entered the wood, a settled, steady feeling she could not fully articulate, like a held breath finally released. She told Oliver she supposed they would find out soon enough, and as she drove home, through the gradually lightening streets of Ashwell Hollow, exhausted beyond words but strangely at peace, she found herself wondering what, exactly, the coming days would reveal about the survey crews, the highway extension, and the ancient promise she had just spent the entire night trying desperately to keep. Mara slept through most of that morning, waking well past noon to sunlight pouring through her curtains in a warm, ordinary gold that felt entirely different from the pale, uncertain light of previous mornings. She lay still for several minutes, taking inventory of her body, the ache in her legs from the long walk through the wood, the dirt still lodged faintly beneath her fingernails, despite washing her hands twice before falling into bed. Everything felt real, solid, undeniably true, and for the first time since the dreams began, she did not immediately reach for doubt as her first response. Her phone had accumulated several missed messages overnight, and scrolling through them, her breath caught at one from Grace, sent just after dawn, asking with clear urgency whether Mara had heard the news yet. Confused, Mara opened the local town page she followed online, and felt her stomach flip as she read the headline posted only hours earlier. Pierce Development had announced, in a brief and vaguely worded statement, that they were suspending the highway extension project indefinitely, citing unexpected complications with the land survey and a need for further environmental review before proceeding. She called Grace immediately, and her sister answered on the first ring, her voice tight with a mixture of confusion and relief. Grace explained that word around town was already spreading fast, that the survey crew had shown up that morning to find several of their marking stakes uprooted and scattered, their temporary fencing torn down in multiple places, and stranger still, that 2 members of the overnight security team had quit on the spot, refusing to discuss exactly what they had seen during their patrol, only insisting they would not set foot in that section of the wood again for any amount of money. Mara felt a complicated wave of emotions rise in her chest, relief chief among them, but also something quieter and more solemn, a recognition that whatever protective force lived within Greymore Wood had made its position unmistakably clear the moment the balance had been restored. She did not think the wolves had physically destroyed the survey equipment themselves. Not exactly, but something about the timing, about the shaken, tight-lipped accounts from the security guards, told her the wood had found its own way to make clear that it would no longer tolerate the disturbance so easily. She told Grace everything then, the full account, without holding anything back, the journal pages, the walk through the wood with Oliver, the great silver wolf and his 4 young companions, the buried heart of the cabbage beneath the ancient tree. She braced herself for skepticism, for the same gentle, worried tone Grace had used 2 nights earlier, but instead, after a long silence on the line, her sister admitted quietly that their grandmother had once said something to her too, years ago, a fragment of a warning Grace had dismissed at the time, as the confused talk of an aging woman, about a debt owed to the wood that someone in the family would eventually need to repay. The 2 sisters talked for nearly an hour, piecing together scattered childhood memories neither of them had thought to examine closely before, small comments from their grandmother, half-remembered warnings about certain parts of the property, and by the end of the call, Mara felt something settle between them that had nothing to do with cabbages or wolves at all, simply the quiet comfort of being truly understood by someone who mattered. Over the following days, the town council quietly voted to deny final approval for the highway extension, citing the sudden environmental concerns raised by the survey complications, and within 2 weeks, Pierce Development had withdrawn from Ashwell Hollow entirely, redirecting their proposed route through a different, less contested stretch of land nearly 20 miles to the east. Life in the hollow gradually returned to its familiar rhythms, though Mara noticed, in the weeks that followed, a subtle shift in how she moved through her days, a heightened awareness of the natural world around her that she had never possessed before. The way sunlight fell differently through the trees near her house, the way the crows on her fence no longer felt like anything more than ordinary birds going about their ordinary lives. She visited Charlotte again, bringing a small gift of tea in gratitude for the guidance that had helped her understand what she needed to do, and the old folklore professor listened with quiet satisfaction as Mara recounted the events of that final night in the wood, nodding along as though confirming details she had long suspected, but never had the chance to witness firsthand. Charlotte told her, before she left, that the pact would need renewing again someday, though not for many years yet, likely not within Mara's own lifetime, and that whoever inherited the responsibility next, whether a daughter of her own, or a niece, or some more distant relative down the family line, would need someone to help guide them the way Mara herself had been guided. Oliver remained a steady presence in the weeks that followed, the shared experience of that impossible night forging a bond between them that neither had quite expected, growing naturally from careful friendship into something warmer, something neither of them rushed but both seemed content to let unfold in its own time. They walked together sometimes along the edge of Greymore Wood in the early evenings, never venturing far past the tree line, content simply to stand at the boundary and feel the quiet, settled peace radiating outward from the forest that had once felt so threatening and now felt, strangely, like something closer to home. Mara kept her grandmother's journal on her nightstand from that point forward, rereading the earlier entries now with new understanding, grateful beyond measure that a woman she had lost too young had thought, even decades in advance, to leave behind exactly the guidance her granddaughter would eventually need. She never dreamed of the clearing again after that night, not exactly, though occasionally, on nights when the moon hung particularly full and bright, she would catch the faint, distant sound of something calling, from the direction of the wood, low and resonant, not quite a howl, and not quite a greeting. Simply a reminder that the old promise held, that the balance remained steady, and that somewhere deep within those ancient trees, 4 young wolves and their silver-furred elder continued their quiet, patient watch over the land and the woman who had renewed their bond just in time, on the very morning that changed everything she thought she understood about her own ordinary life.